There's a disturbing truth that most people would rather not face. Beneath many of our behaviors, behind our struggles, our failures, our endless emotional loops, lurks something more than just bad luck or poor choices. According to Sigmund Freud, hidden deep within the psyche, there may be a silent, unconscious drive pulling us not toward healing, but toward suffering, toward collapse. And not because we consciously want pain, but because something inside us is drawn back again and again to the familiar rhythm of despair. Freud called this the death drive, a force far more unsettling than anything found in the pursuit of pleasure. You see, classical psychology long rested on what Freud termed the pleasure principle, the idea that human beings are fundamentally wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. It made sense, elegant, even comforting. Pain, then, would be merely a malfunction, a deviation from our natural state. But life kept presenting contradictions. Why do people sabotage their own success just when they're about to achieve it? Why do some stay in relationships that repeat the exact same toxic cycle? Why does addiction return just when stability seems within reach? Why does pain reappear, not by accident, but with the cold precision of fate? These paradoxes could not be explained by the pleasure principle alone. And so, Freud proposed something radical. What if the mind seeks more than pleasure? What if, beneath all our conscious desires, there exists a darker longing? A desire to return to the silence of non-being, to dissolve into nothingness, to stop existing under the unbearable weight of inner conflict. This is the death drive, a psychological force that, unlike the pleasure principle, does not seek satisfaction, but resolution through destruction. It manifests not only in dramatic gestures, but in subtle ways: chronic guilt, self-sabotage, endless repetition of failure, and the uncanny ability to make ourselves suffer in moments when things seem to be going well. This theory is not comforting. It offers no easy solutions, but it explains what we often can't: the habits that don't make sense, the patterns we say we hate but continue repeating, the people we leave only to chase their shadows in someone else. Freud wasn't saying we want to suffer. Rather, he believed that within the psyche exist forces that operate outside our will, unconscious programs that override logic, challenge free will, and play out like pre-written scripts. These forces don't ask for permission. They act. They guide how we love, what we fear, and even how we destroy ourselves, all without our awareness. This video is not for those chasing easy comfort. It's a descent into the darker corners of human nature. It's a clinical, honest examination of a question most people never dare ask. Why do I keep returning to pain, even when everything in me says I don't want it? We will explore Freud's concept of the death drive, what it is, how it shows up in daily life, and why so many of us seem trapped in cycles of quiet self-destruction. But this is not a descent into nihilism. It is an attempt to shine a light on the parts of us that stay in the dark, because what we do not face, we repeat. And perhaps by the end of this reflection, something inside you will stop repeating because it has finally been heard. Freud believed that all psychic life obeys one primary force: the pleasure principle. This principle isn't about shallow indulgence. It's about reducing tension, restoring balance. It is the mind's most basic compass, pushing us toward relief and away from disturbance. We see it in the baby who cries for food and calms when fed. We see it in the adult who numbs emotional pain with alcohol, compulsive scrolling, or another fleeting distraction. For a while, this framework seemed enough. But then reality broke the theory apart. The choices we make to avoid pain, to escape discomfort, to seek temporary relief can all be interpreted, as Freud suggested, as the work of the pleasure principle silently guiding our unconscious lives. This principle, Freud said, emerges early. Even before language, before identity, the human psyche seeks one thing: to reduce tension, to minimize pain, to return to equilibrium. But as we grow, something changes. We encounter reality, with all its rules, limitations, and expectations. And so a second force comes into play: the reality principle. This does not erase the pleasure principle. It refines it. It teaches us to delay gratification, to endure temporary discomfort in exchange for something greater down the line. We learn to plan, to control impulses, to sacrifice the now for the future. This is what shapes us into functioning adults, people who can work, love, wait. But at the core, our motivation remains unchanged: to avoid suffering. Freud's model made sense: elegant, coherent, two principles in balance, one seeking relief, the other adapting to reality. Until one day it no longer explained what Freud was seeing, not in theory, but in the clinic. He noticed something deeply unsettling: people who, instead of escaping pain, repeated it. Patients who returned again and again to the same traumatic memories, the same behaviors, the same suffering, not out of masochism, not for any apparent benefit, just repetition, raw, purposeless repetition. Freud saw people sabotage their own healing at the precise moment it became possible. He saw dreams of trauma recur even after the trauma had been fully explored. He saw lives spiral into chaos, not because of outside forces, but because of something within that seemed to crave collapse. And that's when he realized something was missing from the model. There was a force at work, not seeking pleasure, not conforming to reality, but dragging the individual backward, toward regression, toward silence, toward the end. Thus emerged what would become the most disturbing concept in psychoanalysis: the death drive. This was not theory for comfort. This was theory for truth. Unfiltered, unforgiving, unsettling. Freud proposed that within the psyche is a deep, silent drive, not to heal, but to disintegrate. A compulsion not to grow, but to dissolve. In the next part, we'll go even deeper into this idea and see why Freud believed this force becomes most active, not in moments of tragedy, but often when life seems to be going well. If this resonates with something in you, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being here. For years, Freud defended the pleasure principle as the central compass of the mind, paired with the reality principle as a corrective. But something didn't fit. Something kept breaking the model. He began to observe a deeper pattern: people reliving painful events with no hope of resolution, dreams returning like echoes from the unconscious, not to heal, but to re-traumatize, patients sabotaging their own breakthroughs. Just as recovery was within reach, they fell back into addiction, into depression, into despair. This wasn't the mind seeking pleasure. It was the mind dragging itself into darkness. Freud saw something terrifying. There are times when human beings act against their own self-interest, against logic, against pleasure, even against survival. And so he introduced a new hypothesis. Not elegant, not hopeful, but honest. There exists within us a force that does not wish to preserve, but to end, to erase, to return the self to the stillness before life. He called it Thanatos. the death drive. In practice, this means one thing. Not every human behavior is meant to keep us alive. Some are subtle attempts to return to psychic zero. The death drive shows itself not in drama, but in the quiet acts of self-sabotage, in addictions that don't even bring pleasure, in destructive choices that feel inevitable, in our loyalty to people and patterns that are quietly killing us. These are not accidents. They are not flaws in character. They are signs of a deeper truth. That part of the psyche no longer wants to be here. It doesn't want relief. It wants release. This is the death drive. And the question now is, can we confront it before it shapes our destiny? We repeat what hurt us the most, not because we want to suffer, but because, deep in the unconscious, there is an attempt to master the pain by reliving it, as if by repeating the original wound, we could finally control its outcome. But that mastery never arrives, only the cycle returns. The fall, the collapse, again and again. This is the death drive in motion, a force that does not support the ego, that undermines psychic cohesion, that breaks down the structure of emotional life in favor of something colder, emptier, closer to the inorganic. Freud observed this in soldiers returning from war, men who repeatedly dreamed not of safety or peace, but of terror, scenes of violence, of death, of moments they desperately wanted to forget, but the dreams insisted. He saw it in children who played at loss, repeating the experience of abandonment as if to regain control over something they never understood. He saw it in patients who reached the edge of transformation only to sabotage themselves at the very last moment. Not out of fear, not out of laziness, but because an invisible script was guiding them back to suffering. Why would anyone choose to relive trauma? They wouldn't, because it is not a choice. It is unconscious, and that is precisely why it is so powerful. The idea of the death drive remains one of the most controversial in psychoanalysis. It unsettles, it disturbs, it dismantles our idealistic belief that human beings are wired to grow, to improve, to reach enlightenment. Freud's theory doesn't offer comfort. It offers clarity, because what he proposed is that within each of us lies a force that prefers collapse over coherence. This force does not act at random. It finds specific pathways, specific scenes. And one of the clearest expressions of its presence is the phenomenon of repetition. We don't just remember trauma, we replay it, we reenact it, we step into it as if we were actors in a script we never wrote but have memorized by heart. And we do this even when it hurts, even when we swear we never will again. Why? Because to the unconscious, repetition is not an error. It is a function. The unconscious does not think in logic. It does not operate in chronology. It does not care about lessons or growth. It repeats. And in that repetition, it tries to resolve what has remained unspeakable. Freud called this mechanism the compulsion to repeat, an invisible force that brings us back to the same conflict, the same failure, the same pain, with uncanny precision, and still. We don't see it for what it is. We say, I made the same mistake again. We say, I don't know why I always attract this. But the answer is not conscious. It's hidden. It's a repetition of an unresolved scene frozen in the unconscious, waiting to be seen. The psyche stages a theater where the roles never change, only the costumes. This time you tell yourself, I'll respond differently. I'll endure it. I'll fix it. But you don't, because the trauma is out of time. It lives in the past, but acts in the present until it is finally brought into the light. This explains why we return to abusive relationships, even after escaping one, why we chase success but self-destruct at the moment of achievement, why we want peace but unconsciously sabotage it. It's not a mystery. It's a script. Freud saw this clearly, and he noted another sinister element: guilt. The compulsion to repeat is not just an attempt to master the past. It is often a form of unconscious punishment. You failed. You wanted too much. You desired what you weren't supposed to. And so the psyche punishes itself through repetition. Suffering becomes penance. Pain becomes payment. And the cycle continues. This is how the death drive intertwines with guilt. And this union creates a prison of quiet torment, where repetition is both the jailer and the key. But this raises a final haunting question. Why do some remain stuck in this cycle, while others, faced with the same traumas, manage to move forward? What separates the one who repeats from the one who transforms? The answer may lie in something even more subtle, a force so familiar that we barely recognize it. And that's exactly what we will explore in the next part. There comes a point when pain, after being repeated so often, no longer feels like just pain. It starts to feel like home. And that's where addiction begins. Not the addiction we know from substances, but something far more subtle. The unconscious attachment to suffering itself. Freud never spoke of addiction in modern terms, but he understood, perhaps better than anyone, how the ego can form around pain, how suffering can become not just a condition, but an identity. We are not talking about self-pity, nor about dramatizing emotions. We are speaking of a silent psychological process where the mind begins to define itself through the experiences that broke it. Suffering becomes a reference point. It becomes a mirror in which the self recognizes itself again and again. And the deeper this link becomes, the more frightening the idea of healing feels. Because healing, true healing, requires leaving behind a version of yourself that was shaped by wounds. And for many, that version is all they've ever known. Freud observed this many times. People who, after years of therapy, after progress and apparent transformation, suddenly collapse, not because things went wrong, but because they were going right. It wasn't sabotage out of weakness. It was fear. Fear of becoming someone unfamiliar. Who are you without the trauma? Who are you without the chaos, without the guilt, without the inner conflict that has been your psychological backdrop for so long? And so the mind clings to the pain, not out of masochism, but out of a deep existential need for continuity. To let go of pain is to let go of the person you've become through it, and that feels like death to the ego. This dynamic is especially common in those who grew up in emotionally chaotic environments, where affection was conditional, where love came tied to guilt, where being seen required suffering. The child learns an unbearable lesson: to be noticed, I must hurt. To be loved, I must bleed. And that belief becomes the unconscious architecture of their adult identity. Freud once said, "The neurotic suffers from the indecision between pleasure and punishment, and this indecision can govern a lifetime. You want to be free. You want lightness, joy, spontaneity. But deep down, you feel you don't deserve it. You fear it. You mistrust it. So when good things happen, the guilt creeps in and suffering returns. Not because you chose it, but because you never learned how to live without it. This is the tragedy of emotional addiction. when suffering becomes the currency with which we pay off unconscious debts from the past. And this is why healing is not just hope, it is courage. To ask yourself, what remains of me if I stop suffering? Who am I behind the wound? These are terrifying questions, but necessary ones. Because until they're answered, you may spend your entire life repeating the same internal pattern with different names, different relationships, different masks. But is there a way out? Is liberation from this repetition actually possible? Freud never promised salvation. He didn't believe in magical cures, but he did believe in elaboration. The process of turning unconscious material into conscious awareness. To see the pain is the first blow to its power. To name it is to start disarming it. Psychoanalysis was never a promise of happiness. It is a method for attaining lucidity, the clarity to see, to understand, and perhaps for the first time, to choose. And in that clarity, there is a quiet form of freedom. And, for Freud, lucidity was never about escaping pain. It was about finally being able to look it in the eye without being devoured. Not a romantic liberation, but a realistic one. The kind born from seeing clearly what has kept you imprisoned for so long. Because the death drive, that silent, instinctual urge toward destruction, cannot be eliminated. It is part of the very architecture of the psyche. But, and here lies Freud's greatest hope, it can be elaborated. It can be made conscious. It can be understood, symbolized, and therefore no longer need to rule from the shadows. This is where analysis begins. Not as a cure in the medical sense, but as a confrontation, a sacred space where the unspeakable is spoken, where patterns are exposed, and where the ego is given a chance to reclaim authority over what once felt inevitable. Because when you begin to recognize that your compulsions are not destiny, but language, you begin to interpret instead of repeat. You begin to choose instead of obey. And this transformation does not come from willpower. It does not come from good vibes, nor from self-help affirmations. It demands depth, a descent, back to the scenes of loss, to the hidden guilt, to the denied desires that have shaped your emotional architecture without your permission. Freud compared this to the work of mourning. To mourn truly is to recognize what was lost, to feel it fully, to assign it meaning, and then, only then, to move forward without needing to erase the past. When pain is fully processed, it doesn't vanish. It transforms. It moves from the shadows to the center of your awareness. It becomes something human, something that can be narrated, shared, even integrated. What was once a symptom becomes a story. What was once a compulsion becomes a conscious act. What was once unspeakable becomes a part of your voice. Freud saw this in his patients. People once caught in endless cycles began, over time, to find new paths. Not because life got easier, but because they began to name what had never been named. And yet, even with all this, perhaps the most difficult step is what comes after the pain. Because once the suffering is no longer at the center, a space opens up, a silence. And the ego asks, what now? For many, this silence is terrifying. The emptiness feels like death itself. Not because it hurts, but because it is unknown. Because without pain, we no longer know who we are. And so many return to the suffering, not out of need, but out of familiarity, because suffering is the only identity they've ever learned to carry. But this is also where freedom begins. Not the freedom of avoidance, but the freedom of creation. To build something not from reaction, but from intention. And this is what Freud meant when he wrote, "Where it was, ego shall be. Where chaos once ruled, consciousness can emerge, but this emergence is not automatic. It requires another step, a step beyond knowledge, because understanding alone does not dissolve the unconscious. It must be confronted, traversed, symbolized, which is exactly what we will explore in the final part of this journey. What it means, in practice, to make the unconscious conscious, and why this may be the only real way to take back the reins of your own life. True healing does not begin when you erase the pain, but when you begin to listen to it. Not as an enemy to conquer, but as a language, a code that holds something essential about who you are. Freud's insight was precise and brutal. Repetition is not weakness. It is your psyche trying, in the only way it knows how, to process what it could never fully digest. Every symptom, every self-sabotage, every pattern that plays like a broken record is a message, not from a place of failure, but from a deeper part of you still waiting to be heard. And once you begin to decipher this code, everything changes. Not suddenly, not magically, but slowly, from the inside out. Because when you begin to recognize your patterns, to connect the trigger with the wound, to see your guilt not as truth, but as a shadow that needs light, you begin to gain something rare, real freedom. Not the idealized freedom of a life without pain, but the possible freedom of someone who no longer acts blindly. And with that freedom comes a terrifying gift, responsibility. Because when you begin to understand your inner world, you can no longer blame the outer world entirely. You begin to see that you have been both the prisoner and the warden, that you have followed a script. And now, for the first time, you hold the pen, not to erase the past, but to write the future from a place of truth. If you've made it to this point in the journey, then something inside you has already shifted. A subtle, irreversible movement, a crack in the shell, a new voice rising through the static. So I ask you, write in the comments which insight in this video struck you the hardest, which moment made you pause, because sometimes writing is not expression, it is transformation. And don't stop here. The next video is not just a continuation, it is another descent, another encounter with a part of yourself you've been avoiding. Each layer of understanding peels back another layer of unconscious repetition, and the more you see, the less your shadow controls the story. Because in the end, the unconscious is not your enemy, it is your forgotten self, waiting to be brought home.